In 1981, Donkey Kong saved Nintendo. At least, the Nintendo we know today that is seeped into every corner of our material culture thanks to the star power of its characters resting over the framework, or rafters, of modern video game design. Charming, addictive, and most importantly, fun gameplay. The Kong himself, however, was never meant to be the face of a brand, simply a stand-in antagonist. Little more than a big, dumb ape replacing Nintendo's first choice in the fallout of a failed licensing deal, Donkey Kong was Nintendo's first big step into the burgeoning North American video game market. But just 5 years later, he began to fade into obscurity with Nintendo's sights set upon filling a void in the cratering home console industry, beginning a Super Mario mania not with Donkey Kong as his adversary, but the king of all Koopas, another obstacle whose visual design was simply a product of its gameplay functionality. Donkey Kong was no longer needed. That is, until 1994, as Nintendo soon found themselves locked in a technological arms race with a bitter competitor managing to briefly steal the majority share of the market from under their noses. Another iteration of Mario wasn't the answer. Instead, it was DK bursting back onto the scene with a stunning reinvention of the character, setting the trail ablaze for the following three-dimensional pioneering era of home video games to recapture the market's attention and serve Donkey Kong to a brand new audience. One I will forever consider myself grateful to be a part of. Spending my most formative years in the midst of Pokemania and the 3D revolution, it was an incredible time to fall in love with video games. One of my fondest, most vivid childhood memories is unwrapping Pokemon Yellow on Christmas Day before popping it into my new Game Boy Color and diving into its world before I could even read the text on screen. A year or two later, it was the fantastic Jungle Green edition of their new home console, bundled with Donkey Kong 64. I was basically that kid because Donkey Kong was already my favorite character, before passion for video games could be sparked by creature collecting or polygonal 3D. My very first exposure to video games was through the aging Super NES that was in my home longer than I can remember. It probably ended up there before I was even born. And the very first game I can recall playing was Super Mario World. Controlling a portly, yet unusually athletic, mustachioed man with a red cap and overalls, running and jumping through a series of delightful environments that changed dramatically from level to level, in the span of just 4, I traversed a dense forest, numerous mountaintops, a vast lake, and a menacing castle full of lava pits and crushing pillars. With its overworld map loosely contextualizing these locations and relying on my imagination to fill the gaps, Super Mario World essentially taught me what a video game should be, instilling initial interest. But Donkey Kong Country? Donkey Kong Country taught me what a video game could be, upping the ante in nearly every respect. Donkey Kong Country wasn't just another throwaway addition in a library of hand-me-down SNES games rapidly approaching expiration in the midst of one of the largest technological leaps in gaming history. It was like peering into the future and seeing what could be, drawing me deep into its world beyond the screen by contrasting its unbelievably detailed environments and thick layers of atmosphere with a pair of funny monkeys that were a joy to just move around and explore with. It's a game I still consistently come back to as a comfort 3 decades after its initial release. And while it's now been 30 years since Donkey Kong Country instilled a passion for gaming within me, it's also been that long since it cemented DK as one of Nintendo's mainstay characters, one who time has often not been as kind to, continuing to drift in and out of the shadows given his nature as somewhat of a more Western-influenced analog to Mario. After being passed around between several different development teams, his popularity surged, wavered, and surged again through the Country era, his awkward teenage years blurring the lines between main series and strange spin-off entries, and even a nostalgic retreading of his heyday into the next decade, until now. While the essence of Donkey Kong has rarely rested anywhere comfortably between the core appeal of the Country series, driven by Western development studios, and some of the more unusual instances of experimentation facilitated by Nintendo, with the brand new, ambitious Donkey Kong Bananza taking center stage, it appears as though Donkey Kong has not only come home, he's received yet another striking reinvention, not unlike what initially hurled him back into the limelight. It's got me thinking a lot about my favorite ape, particularly because I find myself teetering along this line dividing fans between those unabashedly excited for another reimagining of the character, and those who aren't as convinced this new rendition captures the true spirit of DK. However, instead of digging into my own sentimental past and coming back a bitter, cranky Kong, as I tend to do when surprised by the prospect of a new entry in a series I've long since begun to feel has reached neglected status, I decided to come to terms with my feelings before looking ahead by exploring Donkey Kong's development history for myself, celebrating the games I love, and even uncovering my blind spots for the first time by playing and replaying every last entry in the Donkey Kong series. One whose very first stared into the impossible, meeting the challenge with a tact for utterly enchanting world design, thrilling, addictive gameplay, and a playful abandonment to it all that would cement its legacy as one of the coolest games of the 1990s. So, without further ado, feel free to learn and reminisce with me in this video series as I incessantly yap about anything and everything Donkey Kong. And like any good tale starring a monkey in a whole new world, our story begins in Agrabah?
IBM is here, Apple is here, Compaq is here, Commodore is here, but this is not a computer expo. This is the annual Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas.
While DK's relevance was fading throughout the late 80s and early 90s, Disney's interest in the home video game market was steadily rising as they continued to license out their IP to several video game developers for release on both Nintendo and Sega platforms. But with Aladdin hot off the film presses the prior year, in 1993, they made a more proactive move into the development space for themselves, entering a joint partnership with Sega and Virgin Interactive Entertainment to publish an Aladdin video game adaptation for the Genesis. Adding a bit of complexity was the fact that, in accordance with their existing licensing agreement, Capcom was separately producing their own version of Aladdin for the SNES. Causing both entries to fuel the ongoing video game console war, Disney's Aladdin was effectively competing against itself in quite the unusual fashion during the holiday window of 1993. And to a watchful eye at Nintendo, responsible for scouting some of their most remarkable, yet serendipitous talent, Sega did what Nintendo didn't. At the Winter Consumer Electronics Show 1993 in Vegas, Tony Harmon, Nintendo of America's then Director of Development and Acquisitions, and eventual founder of the Nintendo Treehouse, observed from the audience Virgin Interactive's own rendition of Aladdin blowing the SNES version out of the water. In particular, were the more film-like animations scanned directly from hand-drawn film cells into the game using a new graphical technique pioneered by the British VIE called Digicel animation. Harmon was so moved by this showing, he was convinced Nintendo was leaving prime opportunities on the table by failing to scout more global development talent, just as he did when a young programmer from Argonaut Software caught his attention with a 3D prototype running on the Game Boy of all systems. An experiment that led to the production of the Super FX chip and one of the best-selling video games of that year, Star Fox. As reported in Console Wars, a novelization of the feud between Sega and Nintendo based on hundreds of interviews, including with Harmon himself, immediately following that CES, he wrote a self-described manifesto on the criteria governing a great game in order to prove to Nintendo one could be developed outside of Japan. Soon after, he was flown out to pitch his ideas to a table surrounded by Gunpei Yokoi, Genyo Takeda, Yoshio Sakamoto, Shigeru Miyamoto, and the president of Nintendo himself, Hiroshi Yamauchi. They believed he was wrong, laughing off his pitch until one last-ditch effort where Harmon equated the budget he would need to deliver them one Western-developed hit in 1 year to what they were already spending on just one bad TV commercial. Yamauchi agreed, giving Harmon the green light to spearhead a new Western-led project based on one of Nintendo's existing characters with one stipulation: Miyamoto needed to be closely involved. Meanwhile, back in the British Isles, brothers Tim and Chris Stamper were busy in a farmhouse laying the groundwork for their ascent into game development stardom. The Stampers were, more than anything, obsessed with advancing technology and working 18-hour days developing the best games for the best available hardware. Beginning their careers under the label Ultimate Play the Game, they quickly established their reputation with a flurry of games for the ZX Spectrum, before pawning off a minority stake of their company and spending their main focus into a new label to maintain their independence after falling in love with Nintendo's Famicom. After reverse engineering the console in just 8 months, Rare was granted an unrestricted license to develop whatever they wanted for the NES, releasing 47 games for the platform between 1987 and 1993. Interestingly, given the resulting output between platforms, in the early 90s it appeared as though Rare were uninterested in developing for the SNES, because all the while, they were already looking ahead. Just as Nintendo found themselves entering a partnership for their upcoming new console codenamed Project Reality with Silicon Graphics, who were seeking a wider market for their high-performance computing technology in the games industry, Tim Stamper, who had already developed a fascination for pre-rendered graphics, purchased his own pricey SGI workstation for the Rare office.
What my memory is that it was Tim Stamper who started playing some games which were using pre-rendered visuals, but in very much a point-and-click style, and from there he got a workstation himself and tried experimenting with that. And I think he started looking into how we could get these things into games, because he could see the potential there. In fact, in the game I worked on previous to DKC, which was Battletoads Arcade, there's a sequence where there's these big giant balls that roll towards the screen. I think Kevin used a rendering system to render those out, and he may have also done the same with the spaceship at the end. So we'd done some tests on that before, but that was on a custom arcade machine that we built. We'd not done anything on the Super Nintendo, so that's why it seemed like almost a step too far. If we can barely do this on a custom arcade machine, how are we going to do it on a Super Nintendo? Chris Sutherland, lead programmer.
Yeah, I mean, when I started in 1992 and I was being shown around, it was like, oh, here's this Silicon Graphics machine. It's what they used to do effects in Terminator 2. I'm thinking, why are they showing me this? It's got no relevance to video games whatsoever. Little did I know what they planned, the Stampers were incredibly forward-thinking and really ahead of the game with this. Steve Males, character artist.
A young Kevin Bayliss, the father of modern Donkey Kong, got to work on his boss's new toy, modeling fully three-dimensional characters, a male boxer and woman with a staff, for an upcoming fighting game project titled Brute Force. And when Tony Harmon discovered what he was working on after sliding by for a visit during a scouting trip across Europe, he found his answer to Sega's Aladdin, the best candidate for his pet project, combining Western design prowess and ambition with one of Nintendo's most treasured icons. Nintendo proceeded by immediately purchasing 25% of the company, which would later balloon to just short of 50% ownership.
They looked at it and were amazed at how solid everything looked and said, "We want to invest in this technology. We'll take a look at this." And they went away and had a meeting. Tim Stamper came into the office the next day to let me know how the meeting went, and we'd only got one of these machines at the time. I think we might have just been in the process of getting another one to put in Tim's office. So I'd been given free reign with his machine, which I was really lucky for. And he says, "So Kev, how do you fancy doing this character?" He got a piece of paper out, and it was a fax from Nintendo that said, "We've had a talk, and we'd like you to take one of our existing characters that's not seen the light of day for quite a while." And it was a picture of Donkey Kong.
With Stamper filtering Nintendo's requests via fax machine every night, such as Miyamoto suggesting DK be given a tie for that whimsical Nintendo touch. The rest of the team were effectively given full autonomy to craft a whole cast of brand new characters in a world evocative of our own to surround him in using this cutting-edge technology. Given Donkey Kong's history and the Rare staff's obsession with Super Mario Bros. 3, the genre of choice was, naturally, a 2D platformer. Beginning by fully rendering 3D character models and animations, in addition to remarkably detailed 2D art on the SGI stations before reducing them down to less demanding 2D sprites and semi-repeatable background tiles, allowing it to all be playable on the SNES, the jungles, ponds, and caves of Donkey Kong Island were brought to life. It was so visually breathtaking at the time that when then president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, got his first look at what Harmon had miraculously arranged, he scrapped all existing plans for Nintendo's summer CES showing schedule for just weeks later in order to give Donkey Kong Country the main stage. As it was revealed with Rare's team in attendance, the crowd was stunned to find out this game was running not on Nintendo's upcoming Project Reality, but the SNES. They had a hit on their hands, breathing new life into the SNES after a tough stretch of years steadily losing market share to Sega, constantly pushing the envelope. Even today, next to the relatively modest Super Mario World by comparison, its ambition is on full display from the moment I boot it up, greeted by its wireframe models rendering in real time on that iconic Rareware splash screen. The story premise was the least of their worries. On a dark and stormy night, the young hero in training Diddy Kong found himself cowering in fear of the relentless thunderstorm as he stood watch over Donkey Kong's precious banana horde. Just as the thought of some delicious potassium for breakfast began to calm his nerves, under the cover of the jungle undergrowth and storm clouds, he was disturbed by the sounds of rustling leaves and snapping twigs before being jumped, stuffed into a barrel, and punted into the nearby foliage. The Kong's banana horde was ripe for the taking, and the Kremlings made off with it like bandits. The next day, Donkey Kong awoke after sleeping through his share of the night watch, stumbling out of his bed and into the morning sun before taking a whack to the face like the good-for-nothing grandson he is by the original Great Ape himself, Cranky Kong, cackling over the state of things. A clean-picked banana horde, Diddy missing, and DK shirking all of his responsibilities. Cranky taunted him.
Find your little buddy and retrieve a bunch of bananas. What kind of game idea is that? If you ask me, neither of you are ready for a prime time. You'll never be as popular a character as I was. Why, in my heyday...
Fuming with conviction, DK shouted him down before storming off on his own, screen-scrolling adventure through the jungle in pursuit of his best friend, his nanners, and those crooked, conniving Krocs that made this whole mess in the first place.
Kids today, they just don't have any respect for their elders.
Admittedly, playing this game for the first time as a literal toddler who couldn't read and whose parents likely trashed the game box and manual after opening before I was even born, this exposition was lost on me. In any case, it didn't matter because all the critical info was conveyed in an empty cave with a solemn shake of Donkey Kong's head and a trail of bananas leading him deep into the jungle. The first time I blasted out of DK's treehouse, all I could do was stare in awe, absorbing the pristine, graphical fidelity of the environment and character animation, as well as immersing myself in the incredible sound design, capturing both the atmosphere and whimsy of a uniquely Donkey Kong-flavored world. between the shimmer of the morning sun casting shadows over the several layers of parallax backgrounds, the chirping of nearby birds and insects, and DK ferociously beating his chest all over the slowly building, groovy drumroll of DK Island Swing, it was just so much more expressive, charming, and detailed than anything else I'd played. From my point of view, Donkey Kong Country left such a strong first impression, it immediately put Super Mario World to shame. And that's not to say the series of Super Mario games before it were particularly flawed in one way or another. It's just that Donkey Kong Country was one of the first to stand on its shoulders while offering unique considerations for the player's immersion. No clearer is this represented than with the handling of its HUD elements and the ripple effect this had on the overall gameplay. In Super Mario World, they're always on screen during play, some of which, including the time and score counters, were already beginning to feel a bit antiquated, yet would remain a staple of the series for decades to follow. In DKC, however, while some of these elements remain present and others were removed, in a deliberate attempt to keep the player as focused on the action and as immersed in the world as possible, they only periodically appear for a brief moment before sliding off screen. Following this concept was the buddy system. Instead of implementing traditional power-ups that can even be stored and retrieved at will, as a mushroom slides down from the HUD on the top of the screen, all power-ups, so to speak, were diegetically inserted into the world in the form of the captured animal buddies, and, of course, the unlikely star of the series, young hero in training Diddy Kong. Acting as the more reliable second hit while foregoing the storage system introduced by Mario World, Diddy Kong's unique implementation makes DKC quite a bit less forgiving. But in exchange, his unique set of attributes open up the possibilities for movement and character interaction, in addition to providing a unique cooperative style of play with a tinge of friendly competition by allowing the duo to act as a tag team, letting a second player tag into the action either by choice or out of necessity. Diddy is a natural foil to Donkey in both design and playstyle, where DK is more of a slow, heavy bruiser able to hold the barrel over his head for protection. Diddy is smaller, weaker, and faster, making him the ideal choice when a touch of finesse is needed, yet struggling against beefier enemies. He's also a bit more on the timid side, even letting out a cry should a lone DK pass by one of the barrels he's trapped in, or vice versa. It's another nice touch. This opening level, Jungle Hijinks, is about as effective an introduction to Donkey Kong Country as one could expect. Filled with various enemy types and hazards demonstrating the strengths and weaknesses of each Kong, an introduction to the animal buddies in the form of the utterly destructive Rambi the Rhino, and even plenty of optional platforming challenges and secret bonus rooms rewarding skilled and observant players with a bevy of extra lives, it succinctly demonstrates each of the core design pillars of DKC: type platforming, speed, and exploration. But in my opinion, the most interesting promise appears only at the very end of the level. Just before the Kongs take their final steps towards abandoning the safety of DK's treehouse at the foot of the mountain, the sun begins to set on this carefree jungle playground, showcasing just a glimpse of what's to come. Entering and exiting the nearby cave presents a familiar-looking junglescape in an entirely new context, one increasingly more dangerous than the last. It indicates Donkey Kong Island is not merely a video game world designed to be played, where the conveyance of its levels is contingent on how it will affect the gameplay, but an attempt at a more convincingly cohesive world. Not unlike Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country uses its rudimentary overhead map to contextualize each of its locations within the greater scope of the world, but it's how these levels connect and change over the course of their runtime where DKC goes the extra mile, telling a story purely through the evolution of its landscapes. One where the further the Kong stray away from their home, the more at risk they become of exposing themselves to the elements and treachery of the natural landscape. Early in this transition from the bottom of Donkey Kong Island to the top, throughout the Congo jungle, well into Monkey Mines, the Kongs find themselves traversing these pockets of danger similar to what can first be found in Ropey Rampage, in between the more comforting jungles, ponds, and even the caves, each providing their own atmospheric variance and tone. Because the caves appear so frequently throughout the entire game, most commonly relying on some more subtle image blending techniques to simulate moody shifts in lighting, design-wise, many of them tend to blend together and thus didn't leave the strongest impression on me as a child. However, I can't help but appreciate them a bit more today, largely thanks to the brilliant sound design working in tandem, courtesy of the maestro himself, David freaking Wise. Cave Dweller Concert just has this slight unease to it. It's more mysterious than threatening, with these indiscernible synths undercutting the bass xylophone track, and water droplets echoing throughout the cave, painting a much larger cavern in my mind than whatever is currently on screen, in part thanks to an additional foreground layer of stalactites positioned ahead of the playing field to add even more depth to the image. And whenever that hopeful flute melody begins to emerge just before reaching the level exit, it's just chef's kiss. Maybe one of the most understated, underrated tracks in the Donkey Kong series. And that's to say nothing of the utterly nostalgic, cultural sensation that is aquatic ambience. This ethereal track with a weightlessness matching the essence of calmly floating through the water for yourself. I'm really not the most musically knowledgeable guy, so I truly find it difficult to describe how it holds this enchanting power over just about anyone who hears it, regardless of their own experience with the game. To me, it's indescribable. It's an understatement to suggest the mystique of Donkey Kong Island grips you immediately. 1 minute, you're wading your way through the serene waters of coral capers, subtly refracting over the coral, and the next, you're slinging your way through Barrel Cannon Canyon with reckless abandon and holding on for dear life as your twitch reflexes are tested in minecart carnage. This one, with its endless hazards and downright cruel enemy placement, this one gave me the sweatiest palms and most frustration growing up. Stumbling into dingy caves, abandoned mine shafts, and mystifying temples with little regard for their origins. No matter the perilous conditions, this portion of the game always felt like more of a rousing romp through Donkey Kong's backyard to me, underscored by the brilliant tone setting of the music flowing naturally between that of a bouncy, groovy nature to something more tense and thrilling, not to mention all the cutting-edge visual techniques subtly altering the mood in hopes of keeping each level aesthetic fresh. That is, until the tone takes a more abrupt, sinister turn. Stop and Go Station is about as far as this game would push in terms of striking unabashed fear into my innocent child heart. While DKC is often considered a speedrunner's dream thanks to its tight movement and pace, this is undoubtedly the first level that makes all players feel the need for speed, not out of joyous thrill, but panic-induced tension. The lighting shift is much more dramatic, accentuated by these swinging overhead lamps. You know, the type that almost makes you feel like prey under the spotlight served up to the denizens of this dilapidated mineshaft lurking just out of visibility, the glow of their red eyes piercing the billowing darkness. The rock Krocs here are a surprisingly uncanny, almost survival horror-inspired enemy type, jump scaring players if they're not prepared as they sprint into view from just out of frame. And the accompanying music track, Misty Menace, willfully capitalizes on this tension with the same low-register droning most commonly heard in the game's more ominous tracks. Here though, there's little rhythm or hope, just more unsettling, metallic clanging over the ceaseless shuffling of the Krocs. Given their stop-and-go nature, seemingly deactivating after a Kong makes contact with their corresponding barrel, my headcanon is they've been mechanically modified into a Kremling superweapon of sorts. The first in a series of unnatural deterrents infecting Donkey Kong Island's previously undisturbed locales. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. At any rate, this brooding tone is seemingly abandoned just as quickly as it's introduced. as it isn't long before the duo finds themselves out of the dingy mines and back to fearless adventuring. As for the following Vine Valley, there isn't anything remotely as threatening as Stop and Go Station, as it's most notable for its lack of caves in favor of more thrills and mechanically demanding set pieces, especially the barrel blasting in the likely Star Wars-inspired Treetop Town. That one can be a bit of a life sink. Vine Valley is mainly just fun, continually iterating on existing level tropes with a fresh aesthetic and additionally bouncy soundscapes as if to instill a renewed sense of comfort in the player. The bait with the switch soon to follow. And for that matter, many of the levels of Vine Valley are almost perfectly attuned to help adjust players to an even more addictive, rhythmic style of play after they've spent multiple worlds growing accustomed to the base controls, as well as their slightly hidden, yet just as intuitive quirks. While Donkey Kong Country was primarily intended to capture the attention of players with all of its immersive qualities, often prompting them to slow down just to take in all the details. A personal goal of lead designer Greg Mayles was to deliver a fast and flowing platformer, easy to pick up but difficult to master, that if played over and over again would allow players to thwart the challenge and seamlessly flow through it. A phenomenon I believe is so elegantly facilitated by one simple addition: the roll attack. Without it, DKC already sports a very tight and fast-paced game feel, even compared to Super Mario World, for instance, as the Kongs can naturally accelerate to full speed in an instant with a held press of the run button, as opposed to having to steadily earn that tantalizing P speed. It would be disingenuous, though, to suggest that Super Mario World is incapable of facilitating that same sense of addictive flow. But to me, the difference is the manner in which that flow state is earned. One is less generous and more deliberate, often requiring players to make the most of open spaces and their contextual power-ups to generate speed. The other is actually a bit less thoughtful about it. It's more of a given in pursuit of that goal, and I believe this is best demonstrated by the incidental functionality of the roll attack.
The roll attack was something that took us quite a long time to arrive at. I wanted an attack Donkey and Diddy could do which would support the fluid gameplay, so we tried all sorts of alternatives to start with. We eventually ended up with a roll because it kind of fulfilled what I wanted, which was a fast move you could do as you were running along. You're also able to roll through several baddies at once, almost like a 10-pin bowling ball knocking down Skittles, because it felt very satisfying. I'm pretty sure with the original version, as you rolled off the ledge, the roll just carried on going and you fell to your doom. So it became really frustrating. It was such an easy thing to do because once you got rolling and you hit baddies and sped up, you could roll off ledges really easily without knowing it. So I'm sure we designed it to put the jump in once you rolled off a ledge, to basically try to save you from certain doom. From that it turned into, oh, this actually could be really good for gameplay. So I started using it for the level design where we expected players to roll and jump. Greg Mayles.
Because of this, the roll attack is, quite brilliantly, not just a band-aid for Donkey Kong Country's most glaring issues. It's also the key to unlocking some of the most thrilling, most addictive gameplay I've ever experienced in a platformer. One of this game's biggest problems, a trade-off for its gorgeous, pre-rendered background art, is the legibility of certain platforms. While it's certainly possible to find yourself rolling off a ledge after rapidly accelerating through a sequence of enemies, I'd argue it's just as common for new players to unintentionally plunge to their doom should they ignore the extreme versatility of the roll attack, because it's generally not as clear when a platform's collision zone begins and ends as it is in other platformers. In some cases, it can even be a bit misleading. By first rolling into any precarious leap, ahead of an enemy or not, players can avoid certain disaster while making each of them less punishing by naturally extending the Kong's jumping distance. Additionally, growing up, I used to vastly prefer Diddy's handling to Donkey's, as I can imagine most players do. Because without the roll jump, DK's reduced top speed leaves him more susceptible to falling just short of the edge of a platform. But by consistently roll jumping, I can close those gaps fluidly and effortlessly while simultaneously leveraging his heaviness to clear those beefier Kremlings with rhythmic jumps or even a strange hand slap move. Roll jumping past every obstacle certainly isn't always an option, What with the abundance of water and minecart levels, tire bouncing sequences, and even the animal buddies introducing their own playstyles with a bit of their own jank. But the majority of the game's platforming is simply at its best when taking full advantage of both the explosive acceleration and adaptability the roll attack can provide. One of my favorite ways to begin any repeat playthrough is by rolling as far as I can over the tops of trees in jungle hijinks, dutifully rewarded with 4 extra lives. And yeah, once they've reached Vine Valley, there are so many design cues encouraging players to continue channeling this unrestricted momentum. Take the aforementioned Treetop Town, for instance. This level is deceptively challenging due to its plethora of enemies catching players by surprise as they drop from the top of the screen. Not to mention how naturally dangerous it is as yet another barrel-blasting playground over a vast bottomless pit. However, I think it's even more challenging, annoyingly so, if approached timidly. There's a distinct rhythm to every sequence, placing a barrel to be held over DK's head just before a critter drops on screen. A Kong letter here for players to gracefully land just before a sequence of enemies there, and even the barrel blasting. It's hardly ever given for free. There's even one sequence of barrels here that deliberately breaks the rhythm to keep players on their toes. But for the rest of the level, the barrels rotate on a cycle, ensuring they never need to wait any longer than they previously did for continuous safe passage. It's just good game design, man, and this is merely one level in an entire world packed to the brim with it. Vulture Culture is full of rhythmic barrel blasting and bird bouncing. Forest Frenzy is a twist on the classic auto-scroller gimmick that hardly overstays its welcome, as you twitch your way through swarms of vultures in between bouncing over the heads of more critters. Temple Tempest, a thrilling twist on Millstone Mayhem from the previous world, gets players' blood pumping again, as this time they're being relentlessly pursued by the Millstone piloting naughties. It's hilarious. Vine Valley is even capped off by one of my favorite levels to revisit, Orangutan Gang, the single most ambitious junglescape in the game, full of alternate routes and clusters of bonus rooms. Orangutan Gang is just delightful, accompanied once again by the jazzy DK Island swing, as the sun begins to set, casting a gorgeous orangey purple hue across the backing sky as you swiftly soar over the jungle canopy, courtesy of the high-flying Espresso the Ostrich. Or, if you're feeling extra silly, barreling through enemies and obstacles atop a runaway steel keg. Before one last aquatic escapade through Clam City, for a moment, it feels as though you're back home, lulling you into a false sense of security. Until suddenly, you're greeted by an entirely new and alien landscape. The Gorilla Glacier. Its first level, Snow Barrel Blast, welcomes you in with nothing but yet another low, droning hum and puzzling sequence of distortions, evocative of some of the most ominous trials you've since overcome as the reality of the situation begins to sink in. The Kongs have long left the safety and comfort of the jungle behind them, and the vast abyss beneath their feet ensuring certain doom with one slip. Its backing track's progression from this hauntingly cool ambience to this cascade of arpeggios just as the blizzard's mounting intensity begins to engulf the entire screen, your vision obscured as you perilously blast your way through the single toughest barrel sequence in the entire game. It demonstrates this in such a disruptive, in-your-face sort of way that left me feeling shocked and wondering how I got here. All this for a bunch of bananas? It's typically cited as a woefully dramatic spike in the game's difficulty curve, an example of poor design. And while on one level I agree, there's something beautiful about it. I hate playing it, but I love experiencing it. It is a make or break point, a tonal climax of sorts, where the weak will give up, but the strong will prevail through sheer will and determination. Snow Barrel Blast was as far as I could reach my entire childhood. It tested my limits, and I folded. but being able to revisit it years later and overcome what I once thought was impossible, rewarded with a brief moment of respite in the utterly breathtaking crystal cave that follows before emerging back into the storm in Ice Age Alley, this time slowly dissipating as I fearlessly glide overhead with the help of a feathered friend. This is easily the most memorable level sequence in the game, debatably in the entire series, due to its deliberately disruptive nature. How could you forget that? It's the Donkey Kong Country difference.
The graphics, even though they were kind of cartoony, were far more realistic than any other game around the time. So we felt it wouldn't be right if we had more realistic looking style, but then we had these weird abstract platforms. Wherever possible, we contextualize it. We were never going to compete with Mario's abstractness. Nobody does abstract stuff like Nintendo. So we just felt like we wanted to do something different. With part of the immersion and trying to feel as if we created a cohesive space, we kinda wanted the levels to feel like they could exist next to each other. Because platform games, even some that I've worked on, they always have the most improbable levels next to each other. The little overview maps we drew of the world, you kind of felt like they could exist, and that the Kongs were going on a journey through a believable environment. Greg Mayles.
This intensity carries well into the final act of the game at the peak of the mountain, assigning loose narrative context to all these strange, unnatural disturbances in the landscape. Why are there tires and TNT barrels everywhere? Why are the Kremling invaders rocking a militaristic getup while the rest of the enemies feel like they naturally belong? And where do the rock Krocs come from? It may be a stretch to suggest the Kremlings were responsible for digging out these mine shafts, dilapidated as they are. But I think it's awesome we can even speculate given the lack of clarity surrounding these interstage story arcs. Just before closing out Gorilla Glacier, there's another dark cave level sheltering a bunch of clumps and crushes with a ton of burning oil drums, as if to protect them from the cold. It's another invasive element that feels wildly out of place until the Kongs reach the face of the mountain. The same face that's always been there, with the suspicious set of smokestacks poking out of the crest of DK's brow. And it's where the devastation is encapsulated in full effect. To me, Kremkroc Industries is where the game stops being about getting back some bananas, and it starts to be about making these Krocs pay. The narrative is just as potent, proceeding from the Kremling's likely base of operations here, Oil Drum Alley, to Trick Track Trek, another mine shaft with a long string of transportation equipment likely ferrying oil drums and coal back and forth between the factory and elevator antics. And it's followed by the devastating cost of the Kremling's actions here, Poison Pond. This moment is an incredible twist on the serenity these water levels typically wish to portray, with the striking, toxic green hues and mist effect working together with the refracting water to really sell the contamination. I like to imagine that after Donkey and Diddy clobber their way out of rage through the initial factory, Blackout Basement is the result. Another station on the verge of powering down completely as the Kremlings send the last of everything they've got to stop the Kongs. Just don't ask me how they managed to wade their way through toxic wastewaters unscathed. These levels are certainly challenging, but whether it's due to the first stage of Gorilla Glacier deliberately disrupting the difficulty curve, or the slippery nature of the entire mountain peak eating up many attempts, Kremkroc Industries conversely feels like a bit of a victory lap for the Kongs, and, notwithstanding all the destructive interruptions in Poison Pond, really excels at facilitating this rhythmic platforming, particularly in its factory levels. It's an incredible culmination of everything the player has experienced just before the final battle. Is what I would have said if not for one ultimate buzzkill. Yeah, I don't love Chimp Caverns. You see what I did there? That's what it feels like to enter Chimp Caverns. The true final world following Kremkroc Industries is a bit strange. I've played this game countless times, and as such, know exactly what to expect from Chimp Caverns, undoubtedly home to some of the toughest levels in the game. The challenge is certainly suitable in a vacuum, so it's not really the level of difficulty I fault, it's how it all fits into the narrative and how that challenge is presented. It feels like a tonal mismatch, thematically and mechanically. For one, Chimp Caverns is the only world that fails to introduce new music and a unique level theme. Unless you count Manic Mincers, which, to me, is little more than a slight recolor of the existing cave archetype. And so what is here is an overrepresentation of the mineshaft walkway aesthetic that fits due to its more vaguely threatening nature, supported by a series of endless, bottomless pits, yet fails to stand out next to the other worlds. And I think that's because there wasn't much more story to tell. It just doesn't feel like there was much purpose behind it, other than to pad out the rest of the game to a reasonable length with a series of levels that are too difficult to be placed anywhere else. And look, I obviously adore this game, but these levels just feel a bit less inspired overall and are often not that fun, even exacerbating some of Donkey Kong Country's biggest problems. So just humor me for a bit in this slight diatribe. At the core of it are two issues: screen crunch and pacing miscues. On the whole, DKC actually handles screen crunch fairly well by typically positioning the camera in a manner that gives players ample time and space to react to the obstacles ahead. However, when it's bad, it's real bad. Most commonly when the camera shifts during water levels or when any verticality is baked into the level design. Truthfully, the most egregious examples take place in other worlds, those being Slipslide Ride and Poison Pond. Due to their many twists and turns, the camera often fails to settle into a reasonable position, further blindsiding players with some dubious enemy placement or a few too many leaps of faith. Furthermore, while I've greatly praised the overall pace of play in spite of its periodic, deliberate disruptions, thanks to its additional completion criteria, DKC actually facilitates two significantly different styles of play. One that is fast and flowing, and the other a bit slower and much more meticulous. And after finally hunting down every last bonus room for the first time for myself, I think the pacing suffers greatly because this aspect feels secondary in nature. It's not exactly highly encouraged on a first playthrough, as level completion indicators are subtle, and completion itself provides no additional collectibles or post-game rewards. Instead, seeing that bonus rooms exist solely to reward players with extra lives, I think it's fair to reason 100% completion wasn't a primary focus of the design. For the most part, the placement of bonus rooms is effective. Some are certainly more intuitive to find than others, but even in my own instances of struggle, I found there was typically some sort of cue I was overlooking. A barrel cannon barely visible on the edge of the screen, a line of bananas I failed to identify, and whenever a non-DK barrel pops up, it's usually a strong indicator a secret cave entrance is nearby. The general loop of tracking down these secrets is a solid one I grew to enjoy the more I kept an eye out for them. And really, only an isolated few are notoriously obtuse, such as the bonus in a bonus in Oil Drum Alley. You're twisted for this, Greg. Absolutely twisted. What bothered me most, though, wasn't exactly any individual bonus location, but the process for finding them all. And boy, does it have a lot to do with the animal buddies. I generally feel, after completing this game, the animal buddy system as a whole was due for a lot more polish. On Guard is practically faultless, perhaps because there are simply no bonus rooms and water levels, and as such, he is purely additive to the level design. While the rest are fun to play, there's always a slight caveat to their implementation, leading them to, at best, feel like an acquired taste. Rambi seems to hardly show up at all until the end of the game. And Winky just requires a much more careful approach because his hitbox is so unpredictable. Doubly so given the abundance of tires in his stages. Simultaneously, the most exhilarating and frustrating, though, is Espresso. I should love Espresso, and in a lot of ways, I do. He's ridiculously fast, can glide, and even has this unorthodox raised hitbox that allows him to simply walk over the heads of smaller enemies, which is a ton of fun to exploit. The problem is that it's more common to completely miss him than to see him fully featured in the level design, in turn, failing to clearly communicate all of his strengths. In 3 of his 4 levels, he's effectively a reward for venturing off the beaten path, which is so interesting because he's absolutely the difference between Ice Age Alley being an effortless joy to play or yet another gut-checking challenge just after Snow Barrel Blast. undoubtedly the cause of countless game overs for first-time players. He's also required to reach some of the rougher bonus locations, which prove to be exceptionally tedious due to the way the checkpoint system works and resulting screen crunch. But that's mostly a minor nitpick. I'd argue the worst of DKC's pacing issues are a result of the animal token bonus stages. As they're the primary reward for exploration and bonus minigames, they're a fun and dependable way of netting a lot of extra lives. But in that completion phase, you're going to become very familiar with the screen, and their inclination to sometimes spit players back out at seemingly random points, requiring them to replay large chunks of levels depending on their ability to stage a safe re-entry point, makes the entire process incredibly tedious at the worst of times. It's no wonder I began to deliberately fail bonuses and avoid picking up stray tokens by the end of my completion run. These issues are certainly not unique to Chimp Caverns. In fact, they just as often get in the way in other levels. However, with the lack of compelling theming and purpose, it becomes more difficult to overlook each of these levels' individual issues and value them any higher than what has already come before. Tanked Up Trouble, an interesting and fun iteration of Trick Track Trek, yet fails to provide any narrative significance. Manic Mincers, without a doubt the worst animal buddy level in the game, with Rambi slipping around on tight platforms not meant to support him. He feels out of place. Misty Mine and Loopy Lights, two mineshaft levels played in succession that just don't hold a candle to Stop and Go Station, with some of their own off-putting elements. It gets frustratingly close to pure gimmicky enemy nonsense. And finally, Platform Perils, an unremarkable final level with little flow, necessitating memorization and some leaps of faith thanks to some exhausting gimmicks and screen crunch. It's all fine, but that's exactly what makes this world disappointing, as the expectations were set so high by each world before it, and, in a sense, kind of fails the design philosophy that made the rest of the journey so gripping. In response to a question regarding his perspective on the difference between Rare's philosophy and that of Retro Studios, the developers of the modern series of Donkey Kong Country games, Mail stated,
I guess I'd like to think some of the ideas we came up with were levels that were quite unique, in that we'd come up with an idea, then try and almost exploit it for that level, and then you'd never see it again. I think platform games after that tended to mash the ideas up a little bit more, where you have a bit of this and a bit of that on this level, but then you'd see that feature going on in another. So maybe the levels weren't quite as bespoke as what we tried to build with Donkey Kong, where we wanted each level to be memorable and have a story. For better or worse, it's fine some people might have disliked some of the levels, but I wanted people to feel something towards them. Like, oh yeah, I remember that one, it's this one I really love. Or, oh god, it's the bloody mine one where the lights go on and off, I really hate it. I really think people feeling apathy for something you do is the worst possible scenario to be in. I'd rather people dislike something than feel nothing for it. Because if some people dislike it, you probably got a bunch of people that love it. Hitting those emotions. Obviously you want to create as many levels that people love, but in doing so, trying to go after different ideas, you're going to create something some people won't like, but that's fine.
In spite of that, I'm almost always going to extend grace to any first entry in a series, especially one released in such a fast-paced development environment. And so, I find it difficult to strongly hold any of these complaints against Donkey Kong Country. Additionally, in contrast to this perilous journey that takes players on thrilling, chilling escapades, culminating in the struggle of nature versus machine, there's this sense of playfulness to it all that is so indicative of this creative process. Just barreling forward with the ideas, not overthinking the finer details, and having fun, a critical aspect of the complete essence of Donkey Kong. Following the completion of Chimp Caverns, the king of the Krocs, the final antagonist, rolls up aboard a pirate ship, one that slowly creeps closer and closer with each progression of the map screen. And this has several ramifications for the rest of the series, just because these designers shared a passion for pirates, a passion that has stood the test of time even in the studio's most recent work. And yet, nothing about King K. Rool's actual design evokes that of a pirate. Instead, donning this iconic red cape and crown combo with an enormous, bloodshot bulging eye depicting an air of madness about him. even with as little direct characterization as he receives, King K. Rool is hilarious. He is one of the funniest character renders that could ever emerge from this era of Nintendo, only next to DK himself. This gold, barrel-chested, gluttonous fool's vessel is littered with banana peels, but he still moves with the ferocity of an NFL offensive lineman squaring up for a block downfield. And what makes him one of the most iconic video game boss encounters is his propensity to break the fourth wall, goofily staring into the camera and pulling out all the dastardly tricks he can muster, including a false credit sequence baiting players into putting down the controller before swinging the last punch. He's such a showman, and in a way lends credence to those moments I might have initially felt were less believable or thrilling. Even in its most cruel and frustrating moments, blindsided by an absurd enemy placement, or the harsh pop of a balloon as I plunge into a bottomless pit, I more often find myself laughing than feeling a desire to tear down the game. Only in this world does it feel right at home to have a boss that's a toxic waste barrel called Dumb Drum. Because of the trust and autonomous nature of Donkey Kong Country's development, the character designers were given full leeway to completely reinvent the Donkey Kong universe. They were even urged to resist using any other existing characters in favor of creating their own. One of the first story concepts that was promptly abandoned involved Wario kidnapping Mario with a time machine, as Donkey Kong was tasked with saving him. Instead, they decided to repurpose some old designs from another unfinished Rare project. Ones that became such a hit, Donkey Kong Country would later be adapted into a bizarre Saturday morning cartoon. I remember growing up watching this alongside playing the games, and I always felt K. Rool's dramatic, blustery nature was a natural fit.
There was a game in development called Johnny Blastoff and the Kremling Armada, which was like a point-and-click adventure thing, a bit like Monkey Island. That was in development at Rare, but it didn't go anywhere. And then I guess we trademarked the name Kremlings. There were some designs for Kremlings, but they were quite realistic. So when it came to using them in Donkey Kong Country, I had to change them up a bit to fit them in with the rest of the characters. Steve Mails.
I thought K. Rool was quite an interesting bad guy. He was the start of a long legacy of me putting slightly incompetent boss bad guys into games. So even though K. Rool was the bad guy, I grew up watching cartoons where you always feel slightly sorry for the bad guy because they're a bit incompetent. Things like Dastardly and Muttley, where they're trying to catch that pigeon and they screw it up every single time. Greg Mails.
Given the language used to describe Nintendo's initial hesitation to trust anyone outside of their own walls with such a precious character, versus Rare's own account of Nintendo being exceedingly supportive, it stands to wonder if so much freedom was granted because Nintendo was already so bought in to the unique advantages this technology could provide them, or to allow them to distance the brand from these ideas had they ended up failing. But they didn't fail. Instead, setting the foundation for a colorful cast of characters becoming fan favorites due to their unserious and sarcastic nature that feels so unlike anything else in the Nintendo library. This game, created with cutting-edge technology, more commonly used in Hollywood films, was developed in a repurposed barn with a rat's nest of cabling, and whose electricity would routinely go out due to the insane power draw of their staff's workstations. And they used it to model some plastic-looking monkeys, sticking a beard on one and calling him Cranky, giving one sunglasses and a surfboard and calling him Funky. And Candy Kong? Yeah, we don't talk about candy. To me, that seems to be the theme of Rare's vision for Donkey Kong Country, barreling forward towards impossibility. A team of largely fresh-faced designers and engineers led by a rockstar duo of developers with an obsession for breaking the mold, leveraged every opportunity they stumbled into to leave an indelible mark on Nintendo's history. They were given a choice of several Nintendo characters to redefine, most of which would have been a much safer choice, presumably something like Pit from Kid Icarus or the Ice Climbers. But Tim Stamper said, nah, screw that. We want the best of what you have to offer. We want Donkey Kong, and we're going to do him right, in a manner that is such a product of its time, yet ultimately remains timeless. I think that is what allowed Nintendo to trust them. Their inclination to constantly be looking forward, embracing ambition without hesitation. It was such a fast-paced environment, they didn't have the time to overthink. I don't know, maybe it's my nostalgia talking, but having grown up with, and so often returning to it as a comfort over the years, and even dissecting it in this way in an effort to convey why it occupies this pedestal in my mind. It's become clear so much of the DNA of Donkey Kong Country has subsequently shaped my gaming habits and preferences that remain the case today. It's a game that tells a gripping story with no words, one where the controller melts into my hands, conditioning me into the type that craves that unabashedly fast-paced play, with a speedrun legacy up there with some of the greatest in the Nintendo library, and whose nonchalant sense of humor stemming from little more than silly imagery and an inane sense of sarcasm is foundational for my own, for better or for worse. Best not to think about it too much, I think. As a creator now who often struggles through overwhelming phases of analysis paralysis and insecurity, I can't help but find that mentality so fascinating and inspiring, something I hope to take with me.
I remember for a long time before we were actually getting things working, there were a number of people, including myself, who were saying it can't be done. It's impossible. There's no way we're going to be able to do this. It's funny that the kind of attitude we always had was, even if we think something's not possible, we think, well, let's try it anyway and see what happens. And I think that's probably why we got done the things that we did, because we wouldn't let impossibility stand in our way. We would just go, well, let's give it a go. Maybe it'll work, and see what happens. And I think that's kind of a life philosophy that I learned there. It taught me, funnily enough, the idea that even if something seems out of reach, well, why not try anyway? So I've taken that lesson through the rest of my life.
The Impossibility, that was Donkey Kong Country, went on to sell over 9 million copies, beat out only by the 2 most popular Mario games on its platform. The game that could just as well have never existed, only coming to fruition thanks to Tony Harmon's urgency to strike back against a surging Sega, and whose budget was not to exceed the spend on one bad commercial, was suddenly at the forefront of a bold new marketing campaign bringing a bite back to Nintendo. They were all in on Donkey Kong Country, and as such, were handsomely rewarded. And to think that this was just the beginning. If young gamers like myself weren't previously familiar with the studs at Rare, they certainly were now, with their growing notoriety and trust from Nintendo, allowing them to rise into a dominant force on each of their platforms, with perhaps the best yet to come. But that is another video. What, you thought Rare were the only ones that could break the fourth wall a bit?
Back in my day, we got sequels in a year. Not this 5 to 8 year development cycle crap. And they were better, too. Live service? Gotcha games? What happened to a good gotcha?
Wizzy. Thank you so much for checking out this video. And I know I made a big promise at the beginning of this video, but I didn't say exactly when I have to fulfill that promise. What is certain is that while DK is going to become a big focus of this channel moving forward, it's certainly not going to be the only focus. And on that note, I have a bit of a cool little announcement to make. In an attempt to stay a bit more focused and more driven for this channel, I decided to make a bit of a content split. Don't worry. This channel is going to remain the home of all of my highly polished retrospective content in addition to my video essay stuff. But I have decided to launch a second channel that's going to be the home of my more topical videos in a bit of a lighter, more experimental format. I realized I wanted to do this after releasing my previous Switch 2 video, of which I wasn't too happy with the reception to, but I won't go too deep into that. If you want to learn more, check out my community tab. That experience did prompt me into trying to switch up my strategy a bit more, because I want to try to find a better balance between making the highly polished videos that I want to make, as well as different types of content that I feel will match the level of effort and cadence that I think audiences want. Instead of over-explaining it, I want to let the videos do the talking. So in the spirit of that, I actually just released a whole nother video ranking every single level in DKC 1 based off of what I learned in the process of making this video. It was pretty fun to make, so if for some reason you're still in the mood for some more fun DKC content, go ahead and give that a look. You can find my new channel by going to my channel page and scrolling down, or you can search at wizawhat. Keep an eye out for this smug-ass grin. And in addition to that, let's just say, if you want to hear my thoughts on Donkey Kong Bananza, there may be a cool video coming out over there pretty soon, featuring some other very cool creators. Anyways, that's all I've got until I'm back with part 2 of this video series, featuring what is one of my favorite video games of all time. It's gonna be a good time. Big thank you to my patrons, as always, for helping make all of these videos possible, including Julian Messmer, Questing Refuge, and Blacktooth Bob. I'm seriously so grateful for your continued support over the years. And with a refresh mentality, I'm hoping to make it better worth your while. Check out my Patreon link in the description below if you want to join us on this Donkey Kong journey, or just like and subscribe to be notified when the next video is ready. And like, these games are so rich with nostalgia-inducing traits with strong memories attached to them. So if you got some DKC memories you want to share, let's talk about it, man. It's all about spreading that DK love, baby. Thanks again, and hope to see you in the next one very soon.